Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of Strategic Planning and Leadership. Our theme this week is the traditional strategic planning template. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Um, Most organizations in government and nonprofit areas that have strategic plans have likely followed a traditional approach to strategic planning. It's likely that any organization that you go into here in the next year, 2 years, 3 years is following this approach. And so I wanted to talk about it a little bit, what it's about. But as you've probably started to figure out, this course is really steering you away from this traditional approach. And we'll talk about that a little bit today as to why. Our readings this week from Rummelt, one of the recommendations that he has is to Google terms like mission, vision, strategy, or Google's traditional strategic planning template. You will find all kinds of resources for how to follow the process, tools actually fill in the blank templates that you can use in this process. The other thing that you'll find as part of that search is you'll start to see some articles dating back, as early as the early 2000s, 15 or more years ago, that are starting to suggest that the strategic planning approach may not be relevant anymore in the digital age, based on the fact that things are changing so quickly and they're so dynamic, and that real strategy is such a key to being competitive and staying relevant in whatever organization you're in. So let's quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the components and the processes of a traditional strategic planning approach, but for the most part, this is what is included in that process. So mission, vision, and aspirations, a discussion of core values of the organization. Almost always there's an exercise that includes looking at strengths and weaknesses, which are basically the internal capacity of the organization, and then the external opportunities and threats, so a SWOT analysis. I'm sure you've heard of that. And then, the next step typically is setting goals and objectives, strategies, and getting down to the nitty-gritty of operational tactics. Who's going to do what by when. And then most plans have some form of assessment measuring the effectiveness of that plan, and is also tied to how those strategic goals and objectives are going to be funded. So the question would be, why is this approach possibly going out of favor? And so Rummel gives us a few of his insights about this. I think one of the things that he tries to get across is the fact that crafting real strategy is hard work. It requires a lot of deep, creative, and critical thinking. And template style strategy tends to promote fill in the blank thinking, tends to promote kind of taking the fast and easy approach, and maybe bypasses that really difficult work, mental work, that it takes to create good strategy. One of the outcomes of that is that when you don't do the really hard work of the creative and critical thinking, the leader and the people in the organization may not really have the depth of understanding of the situation and the opportunities to create simplicity out of complexity. And that's one of the things I think Rummelt is trying to get across, is that part of good strategy is painting a simpler story of what's going on. And so the result of that often is that our strategic plans using this approach have a lot of fluff. They have language that is abstract. It maybe sounds good, but when you look at it, it really doesn't have a lot of deep meaning, because it doesn't have a lot of deep understanding as a foundation for it. Rummel also talks about the fact that the traditional approach produces a set of goals and objectives, which he's, as we read last week, that's another one of the hallmarks of what he terms bad strategy. Having a laundry list of goals and objectives, again, avoids the difficult task that leaders have of making real choices between competing values and strategies. And finally, I don't know that Rummel talks about this a lot, but other articles that you'll find really talk about the fact that the traditional approach to strategy typically produced a document that was meant to guide the organization for an extended period of time, 3 years, 5 years, maybe even 10 years or more. And the speed of change, really mostly driven by technology, has made that strategic planning, or that static planning, obsolete and in a lot of ways a liability to an organization. So there were 2 chapters assigned in the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy book this week. Chapter 4, Why So Much Bad Strategy? I'll just say a couple of things about this. Rummel talks about the 3 reasons why there's so much bad strategy. One is this avoidance of the hard work necessary to craft good strategy. So I talked about that a little bit. Second reason he talks about is the leader's belief that all you need to succeed is a positive mental attitude. And so you'll see that a lot in organizations. I've seen that at the University of Montana in pockets where, again, it's this idea that let's have the biggest goals possible. All we have to do is work really hard, and those things will happen. And again, I think that whatever the motivation the leader has for pushing that type of an agenda, the result is that it does, again, avoid the difficult work of making hard choices. And then we talked again about template style strategy being one of the means for what Rummel calls bad strategy. We'll spend a little bit more time on chapter 5, which is titled The Kernel of Good Strategy. So Rummel talks about there being three parts to good strategy, or the kernel of good strategy. So he talks about the first part being a diagnosis that defines or explains the nature of the challenge. So really, what's going on? He talks about that being not just a gathering of facts and data, but really the judgment of what those facts mean. And he also talks about the fact that there is strategic value in doing this process. He says an especially insightful diagnosis can transform one's view of the situation, bringing a radically different perspective to bear. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. I have an example I was going to share here in a moment. The second step or second part of a kernel of good strategy he talks about is a guiding policy for dealing with that challenge that we diagnose. So the guiding policy outlines the overall approach for overcoming the obstacles highlighted by the diagnosis. It defines the method of grappling with the situation and ruling out a vast array of possible actions. So you're starting to narrow down what the strategy is, making those difficult choices. And then the final piece of the kernel is a set of coherent actions that are designed to carry out the guiding policy. So he talks about strategic coordination or coherence is imposed on a system by policy and by design. And so you've probably started to see the word design show up a lot in this course. In this case, what Rummel is saying or using the word design to mean is the engineering of fit among the parts, specifying how actions and resources will be combined. So basically how it's going to work. And again, just like having a really good diagnosis, he talks about this set of coherent actions itself being a possible strategic advantage for an organization. So the example that I was involved in that I wanted to share that has at least some elements of this kernel. It was a process that I co-led last year with a team of about 12 people on campus. The project was called One IT. It was basically an effort to reimagine the delivery of IT services at the University of Montana. And so we had, a set of goals from the president at the time, our interim president, Sheila Stearns. And basically it was to make IT better, with the same resources or less, to rethink how the organization was structured, how services were delivered. And so a couple of things I would say about the process is that, first of all, we followed to some degree a design thinking process that we'll talk about in 2 or 3 weeks coming up in this class. We spent a large amount of time and a lot of effort on the diagnosis stage. We talked to a lot of people. We used various means of doing that through one-on-one interviews, focus groups. We did some online tools that allowed us to gather and assess ideas that people had and have online conversation. We had open forums. We did gather data and analyze data, and so a lot of effort put into the diagnosis. We also produced the report that you can look at online at umt.edu/oneIT. I think really constitutes, it describes our method of diagnosis, but also has what I think Rummelt would term his guiding policy. It has some ideas about how the university should approach the organization, some strategic opportunities that present itself. It does not go into a lot of detail about coherent actions. It does offer some specific actions, but we did leave that a little bit unfinished, in part because we knew we had some new leadership, and the leadership in terms of both people at the cabinet level and our chief information officer really had to be the ones that made some decisions about what those actions were. But anyway, it's an example of something that I worked on. I hadn't read Rummelt's book when we did this process, but reading Rummelt's book and then looking back at how we approached the One IT process, I felt like this did represent a pretty good real-world example of what he was talking about. So that's it for this week. Just a couple of things for week 4. First of all, thank you for your participation in the online discussion last week. Thank you to our discussion leaders, Amy, Jasmine, and Katie, for leading that. I am putting up a discussion board this week. It's not required, it's an optional thing, but I'd like your feedback on how that went. If you felt like you learned things from it, if you feel like you have some recommendations for how we can maybe do that better as the semester goes on. So that's it. Have a great week, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.